L'entente cordiale, or not so cordiale, as both men did the clasp and yank handshake, an attempt to demonstrate male dominance. At the customary fireside photo op, both men were trying to give the impression that any divisions over Ukraine could easily be resolved.
I'm here as a friend because through centuries we've been friends, and we are personal friends, as you mentioned it, because we work very well together. And I think the US and France always stand on the same side, the right side, I would say, of history.
Mm-hmm. The deal for America to exploit Ukraine's mineral resources as payment for military aid is apparently near completion.
I will be meeting with President Zelensky. In fact, he may come in this week or next week to sign the agreement, and which would be nice. I'd love to meet him. Would meet at the Oval Office. So the agreement's being worked on now. They're very close to a final deal. It'll be a deal with rare earths and various other things, and he would like to come, as I understand it, here to sign it, and that would be great with me.
And maybe a trip to Moscow to see his friend Vladimir Putin.
If this all gets settled out, which I think it will, sure, I would go there, sure. And he'd come here, too.
Today in Kyiv, President Zelensky and his wife were marking the 3-year anniversary of the Russian invasion. Ukraine never says how many soldiers have been killed, but it's believed to be more than 100,000. A dozen European leaders were there to show their continued support. A video conference enabled President Trump and President Macron in Washington to hear a direct appeal from President Zelensky.
Our teams are already working productively with the US on economic agreement, which we hope to sign in Washington. And President Trump, we would really like to hear from you, because all our people, all our families are very worried. Will there be support from America?
Other Western leaders see Mr. Trump's refusal to condemn President Putin for invading Ukraine as a potential license for China to invade Taiwan, or any other leader to eye up some tempting real estate.
A free and sovereign Ukraine is not only in the European interest, but it is in the interest of the whole world, because the autocrats around the world are watching very carefully whether there's any impunity if you violate international borders or invade your neighbor, or if there is true deterrence.
The Prime Minister, due in Washington later this week, was announcing more sanctions on Russia, even as President Trump would like to lift those already in place.
So today we're announcing the UK's largest packet of sanctions since the early days of the war, going after Russia's shadow fleet and going after companies in China and elsewhere who are sending military components.
In Semibratovo, population 6,000 northeast of Moscow, they've erected a monument to the 11 young men the village has lost in Ukraine. Cemeteries across Russia tell the story. Maybe twice as many Russian as Ukrainian soldiers have been killed in 3 years of war. As yet, there is little protest, even if some Russians may silently wonder what they're fighting for. Today in Moscow, President Putin was receiving a sword and shield from the Grand Mufti, the leader of Russia's Muslims. The Russian president has made sure that he has the support of the country's religious leaders. And he's clear that talks with President Trump will not stop him from continuing to attack Ukraine.
We're ready to negotiate with both Ukraine and Europe, with any representatives who, in the spirit of goodwill, would like to help achieve peace. But we will only stop military operations only when these negotiations produce a firm, sustainable result that will be acceptable to the Russian Federation.
Sure enough, over the weekend, Russia unleashed waves of drone and missile attacks across Ukraine. Many of Ukraine's air defenses are provided by the US, but for how much longer? It's interesting watching that fireside chat between Presidents Macron and Trump. You begin to see how difficult it must be to negotiate with Trump, because so much of what he says just isn't true. He repeated again that the United States had provided $350 billion worth of aid to Ukraine. Well, actually, the real amount is between $100 and $150 billion, pretty much the same as Europe has supplied. And then he repeated that all the money that America gives is in grants and the Europeans have given loans, so they're going to get their money back, which is why he needs to do this mineral deal. Well, that's not true either. Both Europe and America have provided both loans and grants. So for President Macron today and for the Prime Minister when he comes here later in the week, it's going to be difficult because the ground constantly shifts beneath their feet, even as they're trying to hammer something out. The other thing which happened today, which is significant, is that in the United Nations, there was a resolution passed which condemned Russia for its aggression, and the Americans sided with Russia and did not sign that. Now, in the past 2 years, that has come up every year on the anniversary. So that gives a sense of America actually changing sides and voting with Russia. So that gives a picture of how difficult it's going to be for the Europeans to make this work. And also the final thing, President Trump keeps saying how easy this is going to be. It's going to be so easy to solve this war. Anyone who has ever dealt with President Putin or negotiated with the Russians knows that it's not going to be easy at all.
Lindsay Hilson in Washington. Let's talk now to Julianne Smith, who was the US ambassador to NATO during the Biden administration. Thank you for joining us. Now, the UN vote today may be largely symbolic, but how do you feel as an American seeing your nation siding with Russia, Belarus and North Korea against Britain, France, most of Europe and the wider world?
Well, this is a really difficult moment. As ambassador to the NATO alliance, I have spent the last 3 years working closely with our European allies to maintain unity on Ukraine. And President Biden led the countries, over 50 countries, in their support for Ukraine. 50 countries that we convened every single month for the last 3 years to ensure that Ukraine had the military and economic assistance needed. Now seeing the United States back away to dividing itself, moving away from that unity and siding with Russia at this moment, at the 3-year anniversary mark, is very tough to swallow. And it is not what this country has represented for not just the last 3 years, but really the last 80 years of standing shoulder to shoulder with our European allies. So this is a huge change in the US position, and one that does not bode well, I suspect, for the future of Ukraine.
Well, I suppose Donald Trump would say, well, look what I've achieved already. I've brought the Europeans to the table. They're promising to send peacekeepers. They're upping their defense spending by billions. I'm already bringing in results.
Well, look, multiple American presidents have pressed Europeans to spend more on defense. We've been doing that since the 1980s. And during the last administration, in the Biden administration, we actually moved from 9 allies spending 2% of GDP on defense to 23. So progress has been moving forward on that front. Europeans are going to have to spend more. There's no question.
But isn't Trump doing it faster?
Biden and Trump would agree that Europeans do need to do more, but I'm talking not about defense spending, but about Ukraine, and that's where we've seen the real shift.
Right. So, I mean, we've seen the likely German chancellor today talking about this being 5 minutes to midnight for Europe, that NATO might not even exist already. I mean, is that the reality?
Well, I think we have to be careful about sounding too alarmist. Let's do everything we can to ensure that the transatlantic alliance endures this chapter, depending on how it unfolds in the weeks ahead. I do think it is extraordinarily helpful to have Prime Minister Starmer and President Macron in Washington this week. I couldn't think of a more consequential time for both of those leaders to come to Washington and engage President Trump basically on first principles, ensuring that they hear from those two leaders, the Trump administration hears that Russia is the aggressor here. This is unprovoked aggression. And also to ensure that the president hears firsthand from those two leaders everything that the Europeans have done for Ukraine. As was just noted, European countries have been extraordinarily generous and provided critical assistance to Ukraine over the last 3 years, and I hope that will continue.
I mean, the trouble is, if you go off their public statements, the Europeans don't contradict Trump in his own terms. They have their position, but they won't tell him he's wrong. Is that the right way to deal with this situation when Keir Starmer goes to Washington later this week?
Well, look, having served in government, I can tell you that there is the public presentation of what things look like on the outside, and there are the private conversations behind closed doors. My suspicion here is that you're seeing a lot of grinning right now with President Macron coming into the Oval Office. They stand united, they're laughing, they're shaking hands. But my guess is that behind closed doors, President Macron is engaging the president on those first principles and doing what he can to try and persuade President Trump to ensure that Ukraine is at the table in those negotiations and that Europeans have a role in the future of Ukraine as well. I almost guarantee you that is what is happening behind the scenes, and I suspect Starmer will do the exact same thing.
Well, we can see the astonishing difference between the public statements and what's going on behind the scenes in the relationship with Zelensky. I mean, having seen this extraordinary row last week, in which Trump was sort of branding him a dictator who was a terrible leader, he's now talking about doing a deal and welcoming him to the Oval Office to get the revenue from Ukrainian minerals. Now, that might sound good in one way for Americans getting their money back, but does it also tie America in to the future security of Ukraine? Has Zelensky maybe even played Trump?
Well, look, President Zelensky will have to determine the conditions under which he would be willing to sign some sort of deal that would give the United States access to some portion of their critical minerals. But I do think President Zelensky has been right with his approach in asking the fundamental question, what does Ukraine get in return? I think Zelensky is open to talking to the U.S. administration about critical minerals and access to those minerals one way or another. But I think he needs to ensure that he can guarantee continued interest on the part of the United States in Ukraine so that he gets some sort of security guarantee, or if not a security guarantee, at a minimum, U.S. military assistance to keep flowing.
Ambassador, thank you very much indeed for your time.
Well, for more on whether this new German government can help Europe stand up to Vladimir Putin's Russia without American support, I've been talking to the former German ambassador to the US, Wolfgang Ischinger, and Ukraine's former Deputy Defense Minister, Alina Frovola, in the latest episode of The Forecast. You can watch it all on our YouTube channel. It is also at channel4.com/news or wherever you get your podcasts. Now, Friedrich Merz, expressing doubt over whether NATO's security guarantee is still effective, will only fuel fears amongst Russia's neighbours about their own future. One of those countries is Latvia, which has been one of Ukraine's staunchest supporters. Let's go live now to Kieran Moodley, who's in the Latvian capital, Riga, for us tonight. Kieran.
You know, when you hear Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin talking about the Russian war in Ukraine, it can feel like an alternative reality, can't it? Well, here in Latvia, in the Baltic states, they don't just feel like they're in a different world to those two leaders. They feel like they're also in a different world to some of their European allies. Because as you can see by the Ukrainian flag behind me, the anniversary of the war, it means something here because they know about Russian occupation. And earlier this evening, there was a vigil that went through the old city of Riga. It was a sea of candles, of Ukrainian flags, and also of defiance. Because people here, when you talk to them, they really feel that something different is happening right now. And that is why you saw the Baltic leaders and the Nordic leaders today give a statement saying that they felt Ukraine has to at some point join the EU and also NATO. Now that may seem completely unrealistic, but that's because there is this divide in the European alliance. You talk to Latvians here at the vigil and they say they're frustrated, they're exasperated. For years they've talked about the threat from Russia. For years they've spent more and more on defence themselves, and yet their allies over in the west, far from the Russian border, they just don't get it. And now that frustration is, because of Donald Trump, combined with trepidation. You talk to people about, do they feel safe within the NATO alliance, that if they were perhaps invaded one day, would they be protected? And there were a lot of pauses, there were a lot of shrugs from a lot of people here. There is a sense now that away from those votes at the UN in New York, away from those talks in Washington, here, where there might be the future front line of a war with Russia, they are being left in limbo, and the lessons of history are not being learnt again.
Kieran Moodley in Latvia. Well, Lord Kendarroch was Britain's ambassador to the US during Donald Trump's first term as president, and he joins me now. So if you were prepping Keir Starmer for his meeting this week, what would you be saying?
I think I would be saying that, first of all, that our offer, conditional though it is, of British forces to go on the ground if there is a ceasefire or even a peace deal in Ukraine, gives him some credibility and, as it were, gets him through the door with something to put on the table. I also think he's actually handled his relationship with Donald Trump quite well so far, given they come from opposite sides of the political spectrum. But the key then with Trump in that meeting is not to be diverted down side alleys, as it were, but to focus on the substance here. And your reporting in the last 10, 15 minutes or so has illustrated what the substance is, which is there is still a huge gulf between the parties. The Ukrainians don't want to give back, they want their territory back, and they want complete freedom in future to decide their future, whether it's NATO and the EU or whatever. And the Russians, Putin, wants to keep all the territory he's got and then maybe a bit more, plus he wants a veto for all time on Ukraine joining NATO. There's a huge gulf there, and there is no clarity from our American friends on how they intend to bridge it. Indeed, the suggestions have been that maybe Russia gets everything it wants and Ukraine gets nothing, which is not going to be a deal that I think that will fly, that will be acceptable to Ukraine or indeed acceptable to Europeans. So how is Donald Trump going to bridge this gap? There is leverage on Russia, whether it's the risk of, we could put extra sanctions on, we have $200 billion worth of Russian assets in European bank accounts. We could greatly increase our arms supplies to Ukraine if we chose to. But how is Trump going to get Putin to shift? What concessions will he get from him?
Right, but I mean, isn't that the part of the process in which Britain and Europe, frankly, seems totally excluded? I mean, our conversation has jumped straight to after the peace. What happens in terms of security guarantees, whether British troops will be there, what their role will be. In terms of the actual deal, in terms of trying to secure some sort of resolution over what happens to the territory, it's not even clear what Britain's position is right now. And Britain voted for a resolution that said full withdrawal from Ukraine today.
Yeah. Well, Chris, first of all, I would say in terms of presence or non-presence, I mean, in my 40-odd years in service, we often weren't around the table when various American administrations have been negotiating deals, whether it was in the Middle East between the Palestinians and Israel, or whether it was, say, the deal on the Bosnian War, the Dayton Peace Agreement. We weren't really around the table for that either. So this doesn't feel that unusual to me. But I do think Europe has some leverage also over the Americans, because we can say yes to whatever deal might be proposed or no. We can say yes, we will lift sanctions, or no, we won't. We can say yes, we will contribute to a deterrence force on the ground in Ukraine, or not. There is this issue about all of these Russian assets in European banks. So it's not like we're without leverage. So yes, it would be nice if we were at the table for all the talks, but doesn't mean we can't still talk to both sides and still support or dissent from whatever emerges from these negotiations. And I think there's a long, long way to go in this. I mean, if you look at all the issues that have to be settled, even for just a ceasefire, the idea that we're going to be talking about troops on deterrence force in Ukraine within the next couple of months just doesn't seem realistic to me.
Well, what about the flip side of this conversation that the Germans are now raising, or the man who's likely to be Chancellor is raising at least, which is that NATO's finished in the real world, isn't it?
Yeah, look, I thought what Merck said, actually, I thought was quite brave of him, and there is really something in what he is saying. I mean, we don't know for sure because it depends what in the end President Trump decides. But we do know that Trump is no fan of NATO. In his first term, he actually said publicly NATO is a scam under which the Europeans get America to pay for their defense. So there's nothing radically new about all of the stuff that's coming out now. I think that Europe, first of all, to have any credibility in this conversation about the future of NATO, we all have to be spending a lot more on defense than I would say, though I know it's difficult given everyone has difficult economic situation in Europe. 2.5% isn't going to be enough. It does need to be closer to 3% to get to 3%. But the other thing is, I mean, are we in a position where we can say to Trump that we're all going to do that, and that we are with them on trying to do some peace deal in Ukraine, though it has to be a right deal and a fair deal. What more does America want from Europe if we actually all do get a defense spending up? Because
we must leave it there. Thank you very much indeed for your time.